My name's Simon, as you can tell from the little thing underneath my name, and I'm founder of AWA. So we are an agile company which goes into organizations to really help people find themselves such that they are able to see their own problems and solve them themselves. And we help with community as well. So we have lots of things going on in the community, which probably some of you are aware of. We run meetups, and we also run training classes, that kind of thing, all with the underlying belief that we can all make working lives better for ourselves and for our clients and the organizations that we work in. And I keep coming across various aspects of neuroscience and how the brain works and these kind of things, because a key element of what we do within Agile and Lean is really about people. So I think you can actually sum up the Agile Manifesto as people over process. So if we actually look at what that means to be in an organization, and that what we're actually doing is actually helping people to change, then it stands to reason that we need to understand a bit about people and about how we operate and how we interact with each other and all of the things which affect us in our day-to-day that are going to hinder us in achieving the type of organizational goals that we're asked to achieve by Agile and Lean and things like this and through coaching. So given that people are actually a key ingredient, it seemed quite sensible that one of those key ingredients is what's up here between our ears or inside our heads, and how that actually helps us or hinders us in some cases in actually functioning as full human beings and to solve the kind of problems. So I, in my attempt, went to learn about coaching, and I went to a barefoot coaching class, which is a group of different people come together, and one of those trainers for the day was Amy. So I had the great privilege of spending an entire day learning some of the amazing things about my brain from Amy, and how those things actually affect us from a coaching perspective and from an organizational change perspective. So given that what we do and given what Amy does, it seemed like the perfect combination to bring that to the wider Agile community and to you guys and girls. So it is my absolute honour to AWA to host Amy. So over to you, Amy, to kind of explain who you are, what you do, and how that might help us, kind of thing.
Okay, well, my guess is that you've all come on this webinar for different reasons, so I want this to be a valuable hour for you. So by all means, unmute and interrupt or type into the chat box as we go through. I've got some ideas of what might be useful, but if you ask me specific things, then we can shape this to be as you want. If no one says anything for about the first 20 minutes, I'll just talk and then open it up, and Simon might have some questions, or you guys might have some questions. In terms of what we do, I work for a company called Synaptic Potential, and we alongside Simon believe that working lives can be better. I just think it's nuts that so many people wake up on a Sunday evening or Sunday morning dreading the next day and just don't enjoy their Sundays as much as their Fridays just because they've got the anticipation of Mondays. So I guess I'm hoping to dedicate my life to making some people's working lives a bit better, and one of the ways that we do that is working with coaches to equip them with an understanding of how the brain works so that they can be more effective in their work with people. The majority of my time is spent traveling around the world working with organizations. So tomorrow I travel to Finland and then to Denmark, where we're working with the MDs at Accenture to help them understand insights from neuroscience to help them create more friendly working environments, but also more effective. So I'm going to share my screen and share a few pieces, and hopefully I'll still be able to see the chat, but if not, then anyone that can see the chat, perhaps Simon, if you want to shout out if there's any clarity-based questions that I'm missing or anything. All right.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
All right. Okay, so We've spoken to, hang on, I'm just going to get rid of myself because you don't want to see me as well. It'll distract me to see me.
There's no rush, got tomorrow.
So this idea of neuroscience, I mean, my guess, because you've jumped on the call, you're familiar with what neuroscience is. It's this scientific discipline that studies the brain. Why is it exciting? Because in the last 20, 25 years, we've got access to a huge range of more data than we had previously. So our technology's improved, it's ever improving. So what we can see in the brain in real time without having to look at dead people's brains is dramatic. And that's really, really exciting and helpful. So sometimes I'm participating in experiments. This is an MRI scanner. This is me in it. We're doing some experiments looking at marketing in this instance and how the messages that people see, what actually is going on in the brain when people see these messages. So this is a kind of research that big supermarkets, mostly big supermarkets actually would be really interested in. Most of my time is spent digging through the papers that other scientists have published great insights in, but as is sometimes the case, scientists don't necessarily write for a lay audience or know how to communicate their insights in a way that there are practical applications for the workplace. Many of them are becoming better. So earlier we were talking about trust. A guy called Paul Zak has definitely transitioned from a purely academic research zone. His speciality is oxytocin. He's based over at Claremont University, and now he does talk much more and to a wider audience, and has got some cool TED Talks and other videos out there. Sometimes we're asked, why do you ever get any pushback from leaders around why you're bothering with neuroscience? And we honestly don't, or we haven't yet. I'm still always keen for a good debate. But when we sort of set the frame that, well, your organization is wanting results, and those results are at least partly dependent on your people, as Simon was saying earlier, then surely understanding your people better is a good plan. If so, neuroscience helps us understand people. Therefore, it's not a big leap to see that neuroscience is going to help you get better results in your organization. So that's the premise that we operate on. We don't say a bunch of things like, we don't say neuroscience is the only way forward, or we don't, I'm not a big fan of these new models, methodologies, techniques, or any of those things. I'd much rather share some foundational knowledge that then you can all craft and embed in your existing models and approaches with your clients or within your organization. We don't say things that you can know various things for sure. So understanding neuroscience doesn't mean that you suddenly become prescriptive or diagnostic or any of those things, because we're not putting people in brain scanners or attaching EEG monitors. Even if we were, we still wouldn't necessarily be able to tell exactly what was going on. That said, looking through this lens of neuroscience is hugely useful in adding this other dimension that you just don't get anywhere else, and it's a very powerful one. But hopefully I'm talking to the converted already. So one of the chunks that I thought might be useful for you is just an awareness of some credibility busting neurobabble. So because neuroscience has become very popular, and because many people now are dipping into it, we've got a bit of a problem, which I think happens with any new discipline, and the application of neuroscience into organizations is new. But the challenge that we've got, we're going to get some good questions coming through. Excellent. The challenge that we've got is that some people are taking the headlines of neuroscience and just sticking with the headlines. And once you've translated the headlines too many times, or even just taken the headlines that journalists have written, they're actually inaccurate. So in front of you, you'll see rather a tasty looking sandwich. And while the sound bites might look really good, like the sound bite for this was that eating cheese and meat may boost self-control, or even better, one of my favorites. Eating chocolate may stop you being grumpy. The challenge with that is that they actually came from research that Molly Crockett was doing, and she explains in a great TED talk that these headlines followed an experiment that herself and her colleagues did to find out how serotonin would affect people when they are treated unfairly. So they would manipulate people's serotonin levels, giving them this icky tasting lemon flavored drink that takes away the raw ingredient, so tryptophan in the brain, this amino acid. And when it was low, people were more likely to take revenge when they were treated unfairly. But the headlines that people took away were eating cheese and meat may boost self-control, or what a friend we have in cheese, or cheese sandwiches are what we need for decision making. And that just wasn't what the research showed. And for many people, they're not keen on reading the full paper. But if you're wanting to actually have accurate information, then you've got to dig deeper than the headlines. So one of the things that we teach on our Neuroscience for Coaches program is about reading scientific papers, because we want you to be equipped to evaluate the information that's coming through now and in the future, because there's new insights coming all the time. One thing we then recommend as the takeaway is to watch your sources. So don't just go to the trendy, easy looking stuff to read. Unfortunately, if you're wanting to embed these kind of insights in your practice and your approach, your management, your consulting, whatever it is, then you need to dig deeper. I'm often being asked what part of the brain does X, Y, Z. And one of the challenges with dealing with neuroscience is that it is this separate discipline. So not everything from psychology, for example, love, maps exactly into neuroscience. It's been suggested that it attracts many of us because it appears to offer these explanatory answers to the questions that we really care about, but we can't fall into this credibility busting trap to believe that something as ambiguous and abstract as love can be simply defined and localized within the brain. So it's flawed reasoning and completely unsupported by the neuroscience evidence. It's also worth mentioning, just for those of you who are favouring technical stuff, that an MRI scanner isn't measuring these chemical or electrical neural activity. It's measuring the change in oxygen in blood. So yeah, it's good to know your basics in order to evaluate these sources. So you may be familiar with the concept of the limbic brain, heard of chimp paradox, be understanding that emotion is important in understanding how people work. And there's been major changes, major shakeups in the world of emotions, started by one guy and really popularized by a brilliant writer, a female writer recently. So I think most people's understanding of emotion and how it plays out is quite antiquated in a way. And so to just give you a little snippet of where we need to update, in the 1930s, experiments were done which removed the amygdala, an area of the brain that would be considered part of the limbic region, of rhesus monkeys. And these monkeys were then seen to act in a way that was interpreted to be fearless. And since then, people have sort of focused on the amygdala as the brain's fear center. And if you only took this piece of information, which is one of our dangers, but if you only took this piece of information, then you wouldn't have the full story. So in recent times, many studies have shown that the amygdala doesn't have to be involved in emotion. It often is, but it doesn't have to be. And what makes neuroscience challenging often for new students is that many brain areas are often involved in many things. So you might see increased activity in the amygdala during thinking, remembering the past, or imagining the future during times of uncertainty, receiving reward, even eating or drinking. And that's a long list for just one brain area. And to say, oh, the amygdala, that's emotion, that's often easier. But the brain is really, really complex. And there was one instance where identical twins had very similar damage to their amygdala, and one of them experienced difficulties relating to fear the other had normal fear perception, but the damage to their brain and obviously their genetic imprinting was exactly the same. So the current thinking around the amygdala links to dealing with uncertainty or ambiguity. There's quite a range of mistakes that can be out there, and I'd really encourage you to go back to basics and to, unfortunately, to learn neuroscience deeply if you're going to really embed it in your work. I'm going to share a model now. Having said that, I'm not a big fan of models. I'm still not, but I know models can be very useful. And this is something we've developed called the habits transfer package. And the intention behind this is to help people share a structure that can help people change more quickly and with more lasting effects. So up front, it's more work, but long term, it's more effective. So you might be familiar with these areas of the brain and this model of the neuron within the brain and these structures within the synapse that you can see in your top right hand corner here. You've got the synaptic gap. This may be new to you. This is some of the most technical stuff that we cover in our Neuroscience for Coaches program, because it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it is important to have these foundations in place. A general takeaway from neuroscience, as many neuroscientists say, is if it sounds too simple, it probably is. But let's have a look at this, one of these models that can help us to change more quickly, more effectively. It's called the Habits Transfer Package, and it's based on the work of Edward Tull. And essentially, what we're proposing is, in order to change something, change a habit, which is a neural pathway that's been grooved in, then this process can be enhanced by taking these three things into consideration. So the first of these things is to break down the behavior, to do a behavioral breakdown, as it were. And what we're thinking is that most people do not consider the behaviors in depth. And for any behavior change, you've got to think about the behaviors in depth. So starting there is a really good plan. Edward Tull's work focused on stroke victims. And so for him, when he was rehabilitating people, then the behavioral breakdown would be everything from opening a cupboard, lifting down the cup, opening the lid of the coffee, spooning the coffee into the cup, boiling the kettle, pouring the kettle. All of these tiny, tiny components, tiny, tiny movements were vital that the individual could perform before they started to try and build this new habit. The second area is problem solving. So in the example of making a cup of coffee, it would be, what do they do when the coffee spills on the floor, or the sugar, they end up adding too much sugar, or the boiling water hits them. So problem solving ahead of time from a behavioral perspective is hugely effective in not falling off the rails. So when we are going through this, building this new habit, and if we haven't thought about the problems ahead of time, then it's quite often the case that people fall off the wagon, in dieting terms, or do something that they're not hoping to do. So problem solving is a great second area to focus on. And then finally, this area of monitoring. Having some way that you can keep track of progress is a strategy utilized in many other areas, but perhaps sometimes thought of as artificial when we're trying to build habits. But from the research, I think it's a really, really important thing to focus on. So I'll pause there and come to the questions that have been asked. Okay, where do we start? Okay, I've heard people, and feel free to jump in. I'm just reading from what I see. I've heard people talk about. I've heard people, let's start at the beginning with Tim's question. I've heard people talk about people under stress losing cognitive ability and make full use of their brain. I would absolutely echo that. And the numerous different areas of neuroscience would provide evidence that our cognitive abilities, which aren't exclusively but are majorly needing our prefrontal cortex, when our prefrontal cortex is flooded with cortisol, or when it's exhausted, which often happens because we've been making lots of decisions, or we've been on the go uploading loads of data all day long, then an exhausted or depleted prefrontal cortex then would affect our cognitive abilities. And for example, we might, at the end of the day, struggle to make decisions. I know I've sometimes been to dinner with my husband, and I can remember one time where I was just, my brain just felt so fried. I was just like, I don't even mind what I eat, just choose me something. And actually having that decision made for me was a complete relief. So other people have told stories of, there was a lady I was working with yesterday who said when she was redecorating her house, and the decisions were down to her to make, but she had a really full-on job. She worked for LinkedIn. She'd come home and she'd be exhausted and trying to make these decisions about what curtains or what upholstery fabric. It was not a pleasant experience. So completely agree, Tim. There is definitely evidence to say that under stress or an exhausted brain can make it much more difficult to make full use of your brain.
Thanks, Amy. On top of that, are there any ways to maybe shortcut the refreshing of your brain?
I love it. Straight for the jugular. How can we get around this ancient wisdom and all of the advice that's typically out there? So, shortcut. The only or the best shortcut that's evidence-based that I'm aware of would be to practice mindfulness or something similar. And the reason for that, I've got all my props packed, but our head is normally like a snow globe where all of the thoughts are zipping around, and that's several networks that are typically active. And what we need to do is quieten those networks, especially quieten the default mode network, which kicks into action all the time, it's default, and activate another network, which then has been correlated with better connectivity between areas of our brain, which would then could give more capacity when you need it, and also could inhibit things that could be debilitating you during the day. So that would be the best shortcut I'd see. And you could also use it like a patch. So I think there's some research there's some research in progress in the States, but they've not got the full set of results yet, but that looks at just 5 minutes. So 5 minutes of mindfulness or something equivalent that then can refresh you, decrease your stress levels and go back in. Another one, if we're talking about stress, shortcut would be to raise your oxytocin levels, because it's competitive with your cortisol. So anything that releases oxytocin, a long hug or 20-second hug, to a lesser degree looking at a photo of someone that's important to you, that will release oxytocin. The best way is an orgasm, but it's not always practical at work. So that helped him.
It does help. If I'm ever in the office and suffering from stress, I'll remember that advice.
Okay.
Can you advise me of any good lawyers, just in case?
Yeah, I know. Back up.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Okay. If we move to the next person in the line's message, we had from Ashma, losing something suddenly also makes you take decisions foolishly and unpractically. How to overcome this fear and take control of life? Oh, that's a good complex question. Losing something suddenly, depending on what it is, could determine what's going on in the brain at that time. So if it was something, for example, that you'd anticipated and sort of hoped for, and then you didn't get it, you might sort of get raised dopamine levels and then them come crashing down, which sometimes it's high levels of dopamine that can make more risky behaviours. So I'm not sure what would then be causing the foolish decisions, but experientially I can see how that would be the case. But then we're talking about fear. If I were to just take the last part of your comment, and if you want to jump in and sort of give me some more context, then by all means do. But otherwise, thinking about taking control of life and not making unwise decisions, that would link to strengthening the networks that you need, typically for regulating emotions potentially. So the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, maybe shrinking the amygdala, which has been shown from mindfulness meditation as well. So we've got a little bit of a theme going on of mindfulness at the moment. Feel free to jump in, Ashma, and otherwise I will. Oh, Simon?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was just waiting to jump in case Ashma was going to jump in before me. I didn't want to jump in, but could this be related to if losing something suddenly could sort of trigger that emotional response, which is like a form of stress in a way. For example, if I lose my keys suddenly and I realize I've got to be somewhere, or I lose something of value to me, and that causes an emotional response, which we could then, which, as you were saying earlier on, to do with when we talked about the first question about stress, reducing the ability to use all the cognitive force of your brain, perhaps losing something could trigger that kind of stress, which would then, I think of the word downshifting, but I know that's completely inaccurate in terms of neuroscience, but this idea of kind of moving from the cognitive center into the kind of emotional sense and not having that cognitive ability, which then may lead on to doing foolish and unpractical things. And then maybe if you see a pattern in yourself, you may then generate a fear for that pattern. That's about as best as I could interpret it based on what you'd said. Does that, I don't know whether that's any clarity. Does that ring true for anybody? I don't know.
It's interesting. There's another comment a bit further down by Craig, saying that your emotional state has a big impact on your cognitive thought and vice versa. I'd say one of the biggest updates in thinking around emotions is that, which is much more in alignment with the bigger picture of neuroscience and great for any coaches, is that it's not that we are victims to our emotions. And actually you've got a lot of prefrontal cortex involvement, so your logical thinking brain in stereotypical terms, involvement with the emotional responses, which is different from how it's been positioned for the past couple of decades. And Craig also raises System 1 and System 2, the psychological constructs that Daniel Kahneman has popularized through his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, which is quite a dense book, very small print, but very, very good book. So if you fancy some psychology, then dig deep into that. Neuroscience has a paralleled construct, a paralleled I guess research stream, which is the hot and cold system that we tend to teach on the Neuroscience for Coaches program, because then the offshoots and the behavioral science that are so impactful when talking about how to change, how individuals can change and how organizations can change, is really huge. There might also be something the threat response that I know, Simon, we talked about when we were on that barefoot day.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, trying to remember the details of it.
Do you want me to show you the details? Hang on.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think it was really useful for me.
Share screen. Okay, so normally we take a long time to teach this, but I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So essentially we have this threat response that can occur in the brain, and the process itself uses up lots of glucose and oxygen, basic substrates. Lots of processes in the brain utilize these, obviously, but the impact of that is that there's less available for your working memory, so it decreases our working memory capacity, and this has the impact of impairing creative insight, analytical thinking, problem solving, all of which are really critical in most organizations. You could summarize to say that the threat response would decrease efficiency, effectiveness, and productivity. Some of the areas of the brain that are involved are the amygdala, the anterior cingulate cortex, and your frontal lobes. Your ACC is like your warning light, so alerting you to if anything seems off kilter. You might link it to a gut feel, but you might not connect it with that. It releases cortisol, and this is a slower acting, longer lasting chemical than your more adrenal fight or flight response. So there are similarities between these two responses, but they're not the same as far as we can tell at this point. Obviously, some cortisol is great, is fine, is exactly what we want, especially in the mornings. We wouldn't get up without it. But what we're talking about here is these prolonged elevated levels of cortisol, which can decrease your immunity, meaning you get sick more often, impair learning, affect memory. So this threat response is quite pivotal when we're talking about either change or anyone going through stressful situations, which many organizations are in different ways. And it's also important to note that and we could explain it much more fully, but it's important to know that the threat response is not just occurring when people feel threatened or when there's a threatening situation. People can experience this threat response for many different reasons, and it might trigger it for Simon in a particular situation and not for me. And then the next day it might be a different situation and I would completely have this threat response triggered, and Simon, might have his reward response triggered. So we're all very different. There are themes and there are things that we can teach to help, especially leaders and people working in organizations, to try and cushion against it occurring and be aware of what to do when it is occurring. So for example, if you've just had a meeting and you've probably triggered the threat response in some of the people in the meeting, then your best bet is not to try and draw out of them their best creative thinking or problem solving abilities. And that's often what we do, but it's not typically going to get the best result.
So I guess then from an organizational perspective, the threat response of being in a very command and control organization that's very deeply hierarchical, where the kind of agile transformation and lean transformation is coming from a central top-down approach where people are being told what to do and told how to change, this is highly likely to induce the threat response. And if the threat, from what I'm understanding from what you're saying, Amy, is that the threat response is then going to reduce our creative behavior, reduce the ability to do knowledge work. So this is something that obviously we really need to be aware of in our own change programs and the way that we speak to people and the way that we work with people, because our kind of remit is to make people's working lives better, to make environments which are better for knowledge work, better for creative work, have people collaborating better and openly. And a change program may well bring around the kind of threat response which actually diminishes those things.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
Yeah. So again, it's this whole kind of thing of slowly, incrementally bringing in things, making sure people feel comfortable, getting people to own their processes. All these kind of things are backed up by this, the explanation of neuroscience. That we try and force things on people, it's going to actually stop them from actually improving themselves and the world around them. Fascinating. Yeah.
And
sorry.
No, I mean, we can jump back to Craig raised this point, which I haven't checked out the link, but if this is the research done with judges who are making decisions in the morning or just before lunch, which I think it might be, then it's a brilliant piece of research, and it's comical, but also it's like, oh my gosh, it's awful. Which, Craig, I don't know whether you want to explain it if it is that. If not, I'll start. Yes, that's it. Okay, good, Craig. So essentially, judges were found to be making much quicker decisions before lunchtime and denying parole to prisoners. And the thinking is that they were, one, they were probably mentally exhausted before lunch, but two, they were probably the substrate glucose, they probably used most of it up. And I mean, this is really important for us to be aware of as individuals, and to be sensitive to where we sit when we're working with people or organizations. Where are we actually sitting in their day? Are we just before lunchtime? Because if so, they're likely to be in a different state to if we've got them just after breakfast time, or if we've got them at the end of the day. And, you know, they often say on the public speaking circuit that if you're just after lunch, you've got the graveyard slot. But in some ways, it's better to have the graveyard slot than the before lunch slot, depending on what you're wanting from people.
Yeah.
Dijan's
Yeah,
just... Oh, go on, Simon.
If you want a quick binary decision from someone, then get it, like, force them to have a late lunch, and get them in just before lunch, and give them questions, closed-ended questions, and get them to make a binary decision. And I guess if you actually want a thoughtful, more creative decision, or a discussion, or actually a pivotal conversation where it involves co-creation, it's probably better to have it after lunch. Would that be a reasonable thing to?
Or even during lunch.
During lunch, yeah.
Possibly, depending, but certainly one of the ways I think we can release more oxytocin is to eat together, to be in the social environment. If it's home cooked food, even better. So depending on what decisions or what exploration you're wanting, that could be beneficial.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, really fascinating. Okay.
Jumping back to Dijan's asked about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, I presume. And there is a great guy whose name is currently escaping me. He's an American neuroscientist. He advised on the film that Leonardo DiCaprio's in. He's lovely. I've interviewed him lots. If I just turn around, I'll be able to see his book, I'm sure. One of his books, because he's written specifically on OCD. It's something like the four ways of OCD, and his research is the research that I would recommend. Okay, so I would suggest Jeffrey Schwartz. You can see his name there, Jeffrey Schwartz. It's not this book, this is another book, another great book, but his book on the four something. But if you look up Jeffrey Schwartz and OCD, you'll find him, and he talks about potential areas of the brain that might be functioning less well, and that be one of the causes, and then how to, the other 4 steps, how to support people with OCD. And mental health is one of these things that we're talking about more and more, which is great, because 1 in 4 people are experiencing some form of mental health challenge in their lifetime. So it invariably comes up when talking about the brain now.
I don't know if you can hear me now. Can you?
We can, yes.
All right. Just on the subject of OCD, I actually have a friend who has very, very bad OCD, and she was on a trial scheme where she had an electrode sort of implanted in her brain. The OCD is totally gone. It was incredible. One of the first ever people to have it.
That's amazing, and it's things like that that are so brilliant to hear, because there are all these mental health challenges and other challenges that we can try and battle through, trying to make better, and then sometimes there's just one stick an electrode in and boom, it's gone. And all of us would love that magic pill, wouldn't we, for all sorts of things in our life. But I'm glad she's accessed it, and thanks to Dijan for putting that link in, the 4 steps. That's great. Now, A. Harty has asked if there are any examples where we've used the HTP package in the workplace. So one of the clearest examples was when I was working with a company in Serbia, and they were your typical techie company. So it was 3 founders had started the company in their bedroom, and it had then sort of grown into this big company that makes games. And one of all of them wanted to develop more of a feedback culture. And one of the founders was saying, look, I don't even remember to give people feedback. I really want to give people feedback. I want to develop that habit. And so just in a sort of workshop setting, we talked through this model. And for him, the the behavioural breakdown, that was important. So we had to get clear on what would actually constitute giving positive feedback, how many times he wanted to give it, you know, what it could look like, what it couldn't look like. So that was the first step, breaking that down, the behaviour. Then the problem solving, I got to play devil's advocate, which is always quite fun, and say, well, you know, well, what happens when you're away on business? Because he decided he wanted to give 3 pieces of positive feedback every day. That was it. It could be in different forms. So what happens when you're not in the office? Oh, then workshop that. What happens when you are when you're in a really bad mood and there's literally nothing positive you can think of? Oh. And so go through all of the problem solving components. And then possibly the most impactful piece for him was this monitoring piece, which to develop habits has been shown through a lot of behavioral science research to be really important. And for him, we just came up with a very straightforward grid that he could draw out on a piece of paper that had got 3 rows for the 3 pieces of positive feedback he wanted to give it, and the 5 columns for each of the work days. And he got so excited about it. He thought it was brilliant because he could put it up on his desk and he could tick them off as he goes through the day. And for some people, they might think that that was making something which should be very personal and sort of nice and fluffy in a way, this cold, sort of calculated, planned and ticked off kind of procedure, which in some ways it was. I can see that argument. And ultimately, if he becomes a person that is better at giving feedback regularly, then I think that will mitigate that situation. But so for him, it was very useful. So that's the example that comes to mind immediately. A hearty. Tim has asked, change and transformation often triggers cognitive dissonance. Are there any ways to help others through that? Yes, Simon?
So my question would be, is cognitive dissonance actually a bad thing?
That was
I think I would say cognitive dissonance actually can be really good to trigger emotional change in somebody, such that they look and reflect on themselves, such that it's a great mirror, because we all chug along with habits and our ways of doing things, like these grooves in the brain, if you like. That's my technical speak. And cognitive dissonance can often jump us out of those grooves, such that we can then have a look back on the situation and say, kind of, oh, let me take stock of this. Is there something here I've missed? And maybe there's a learning opportunity. What do you think, Amy? Is that?
Yeah, I agree. I think I wouldn't necessarily label cognitive dissonance as bad. So I'd be interested, Tim, what are your thoughts around what's manifesting as needing help through something?
So I guess in terms of organisational change and transition and transformation of people through that change, they often struggle holding on to 2 ideas. The way that I do my work has been successful in the past, but I'm being asked to change the way I deliver my work in the future. So what was wrong with that? So holding those 2 ideas is actually quite a challenge for them. But it's interesting that Simon's comments about cognitive dissonance being a positive, I can see how that's beneficial, but I guess in this case it's specifically a fairly negative thing where people are trying to reconcile the fact that they're being asked to change.
I don't think this is anything based on neuroscience, but I'd be sort of questioning whether they're connected with the possible benefits of the new way. So I think actually no, it does link to neuroscience. So you need the reward to be bigger than the pain to get there, or the challenge, or whatever the cost, and how that's positioned in the brain will determine the neural responses you have to things. So, and it's dead simple. It's how big is the carrot, you know, how big is the reward that we're moving towards. So while yes, you might have been good in the past, I think it's got to be that this new way is better. If the new way is better, then I'd say they're right. If the new way is not better, then I'd say they were right to have issues, which is sometimes the reality in organisations, which probably needs a different approach. But if it is that this new way that's being proposed is going to be better, then everything's got to be done to frame that and sort of raise that up in people's minds of, yes, what you were doing was fine, was good, but this is much better. How does that sit?
Yeah, I can see your point. I think, I guess from my perspective, I was thinking more about the kind of fear or risk associated with it. So I think it plays into that kind of, you know, a lot of the stuff we've already spoken about.
Yeah, so if the in order for someone to neurally want to do something, or to be wanting to take action in a way, consciously or unconsciously, I'd say that you've got to have, the reward has got to be bigger than the risk. And so it's how that reward is managed to slot into people's brains, how they connect with that, and how the risk is managed. So the risk of change, the risk of loss, all of those things, if they're talked about, if they're managed, then you stand a better chance of it.
Cool. I'll have to have a think about ways we can make the reward more obvious, because the risk is very, very obvious.
Yes. Yeah, and it's often, and by reward, obviously, I know you know, but just for clarity, I'm not talking about a monetary reward. I'm not even talking necessarily about the sort of some of the classic things, but I'm so the brain treats a whole range of different things as rewards. So how we, you know, social connection. So yeah, look at what it is you're asking people to do, and then look at all of the possible benefits and think about core needs of humans. And if we can link it back to these core needs, then that's
I'm thinking in terms of organisational change. If we can have very small, like micro milestones that people meet, maybe that will deliver some sort of reward.
That's brilliant. Yep, because every time you hit a micro milestone, then you're likely to get a dopamine release, which will reinforce the behaviours. So definitely a good plan to break it right down, rather than it be this big thing. It's like anything, isn't it? If you've got to sit down and write a whole book, you go, but if you've got to sit down and write just the introduction to the first chapter, well, now we're talking. That's manageable.
Great, thank you.
I wonder if what we're talking about here is decision making, and whether someone will decide to accept that change or not, or whether does decision making happen from the cognitive part of the brain, or is it an emotional part of the brain that allows us to commit to something in the future? Because we can all say, yeah, I'm going to go down the gym 3 times a week and I'm going to get really fit, and I'm deciding to do that. And then, of course, the reality kicks in, and actually we don't go to the gym, other things come on, and we haven't made that commitment. But there's other commitments that we make when something deep inside it feels, when we make that commitment, and no matter what happens, we're going to do that thing, and everything else moves out the way. And I relate this to some of the things lately about data, kind of people bringing data to make decisions, and then other people are saying, actually, I don't care about the data, it's like an emotional response, and that's how I'm making my decisions. I don't even care about the data, I just know and I feel what's right and I go with that. So I wonder, from a neuroscience perspective, what about, where do we make decisions, and what's all that about?
I love it. Well, I'd say both those camps that you've just described are misguided. So I would suggest that, not to be blunt, I would suggest that it's multiple areas of the brain that are involved in making decisions. So it's not just your logical, rational thinking, which would be how Spock is personified, and how system, or I can never remember whether it's system 1 or 2 in Kahneman's thinking. In neuroscience, it would be the cold system. So very analytical, logical, rational, just sort of more of the prefrontal cortex areas, these sort of higher evolution areas of the brain. Research shows that actually without deeper structures of the brain, for example, the amygdala, then decision making is near impossible. And you get someone and you just ask them to choose between a blue pen and a black pen. If they've not got functionality of their amygdala or other areas of the brain, then they'll just look at them for forever and just not be able to weigh up and make that decision. So certainly, even for people that think emotions are not important, areas of the brain that are involved in emotional processing are important. So that would be the first easy thing to say. Different decisions may recruit different networks and different areas of the brain, and there be slightly different processes. Decisions are not straightforward, but one of the things that would be important in them is memory storage. So the memories that we've been storing influence our decisions now and going forward. So when some people say that they're just intuitive and they just feel a decision, it might be that they've got really great connectivity between their insula, their ACC, and their prefrontal cortex, and that they're feeling into something. But I don't think of that as a feeling thing. I think it's that the data that they've uploaded is then being processed unconsciously, and then just the decision or the data that they need, the end result that they need to be aware of, is coming into their awareness. So that process is reliant on the uploading of quality information. So you could have two people that may think that they make the decision in the same way, you know, they just trust their gut or whatever they say, but the quality of those two decisions may be dramatically different. So do you ski, Simon?
Ski. I gave it a go, but I wouldn't call myself a skier, but yeah.
Okay, I just had this feeling maybe you were a skier. Obviously you're not. If we took someone that's not Simon, that is a skier, and you put them at the top of the ski slope, and you put either myself or Simon next to him, then if it was this really challenging ski slope and we were having to try and make decisions on how to even start or go down it, or, you know, navigate the best route or anything like that, you know, I could say I'm going to trust my instinct here, but my instinct is going to be really poor because I don't have any data as to how to make these decisions. I might have some physics data that might help me make some snap decisions. I don't know, but I'd say there are numerous things that impact the quality of our decisions, and one of those is the data that's been uploaded up to this point. But that doesn't mean that we're necessarily consciously processing and manipulating that data. So I could go on for a long time on decisions, but in short, then I'd say it's both emotional and logical, rational, but multiple areas of the brain involved and multiple processes involved.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So if it seems simple, it probably isn't true, basically. Sorry, carry on. Yeah.
I'm new to the neuroscience part, but what I'm interested in is, even when you have someone that's emotional or someone that's very logical, it tends to happen that if you just sit and listen to them, they'll all come to a decision. So like with Nancy Klein's thinking environment, if you ask someone, what do you think we should do about X, when they haven't been able to make a decision, whether they're emotional, rational, whatever, you just sit and listen for half an hour and they'll decide. So does it really matter which part of the brain they're using to make the decision?
It depends on your agenda, I suppose. I think there's value in, I agree that people typically will come to a decision, and also we know that once a decision is made, people feel differently about that decision. Typically we have a bias towards the decision that we've just made. Doesn't stand up all the time, but typically. I think there's value in knowing the process behind decision making and in different contexts, because then we can potentially cushion against poor decisions. So for example, unconscious bias could be an example of, there might even be, no, there's unconscious coming up, but could be an example of poor decision making. And if I'm aware of some of my personal typical unconscious biases, then when I'm put in those situations, rather than make a snap decision saying, oh, you know, I'm trusting my instinct or whatever, my instinct might be rubbish in this instant, and actually I'm being biased and it's going to be to the detriment of the company or the colleagues. So sometimes there might be merit, but definitely thinking environment, yeah, it's great to see people making those decisions. Thanks. I'm going to have a look at some more people's comments, but feel free to jump in.
So we've probably got time for one more, just with my facilitator hat on.
Go for it, Simon. Is there one you want to choose?
Oh no, not particularly. I was just doing my facilitator bit. That was all. Certainly, we can choose from the list here.
Oh, there's a comment there that I've just read by Navtesh. It's a comment and a question, I guess. What's the neuroscience explanation for poor concentration focus, and what do you recommend to improve focus on task? I know the overwhelming barrage of tech devices in our lives has a part to play. It completely does have a part to play. So we're literally depleting our brain. For those of us that get on our phone first thing in the morning, then from the moment we wake up, we're starting to deplete our brain by and not just deplete it, I don't want to be too negative, but we each time we upload data, each time we ask it to make a decision, that takes that's takes a toll to a degree on our brain, and so being aware of that is really important, and just being just choosing where we invest our energy and attention. Explanation for poor concentration and focus. It's really interesting, actually, because I notice it in my 5-year-old now, and I think kids are wonderful to sort of see their brain in a really raw state in some ways, because they've got the same brain as us. Some areas are not as developed as ours, but I know there are some things that she can concentrate on and focus on with no problem for, you know, hours, days probably, if we let her on end. So she loves Mystery Science, which is this brilliant science program thing, and you do scientific experiments and you learn about the science behind it, and you come up with these ideas. She can focus no problem for loads of time on it. Yet you ask her to do her spellings or do some, you know, long writing. She's yes, mummy, yes, 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 yes. And trying to bring her back to the pace that her school want her to go at is near impossible. And I mean, that's just one very overt thing of how engaged with something are we? What have we actually primed our brain with? And a lady, you'll laugh, but there was a lady in the steam room earlier today who we got chatting, and she was saying how she struggles to read things. And I said, well, what are you reading? I was like, do you enjoy what you're reading? She says, oh no, it's work stuff. And I thought, well, that's probably part of the problem, because from a neuroscience perspective, in order for us to concentrate on something and get data in, we've got to be engaged with it, and we've got to have higher levels of dopamine to help with concentration and focus. So you can trick a dopamine release. It doesn't have to be linked to what you're just about to do. So for me, and I know this is like a hack, isn't it? But for me, and my husband does laugh, but I'll always write out the things that I've already done when making my to-do list, just so I can have some things ticked off. And then I start feeling really good. I was like, yeah, I've already got 3 things done. Granted, I did them earlier before I even started the list, but and then I'm feeling good and feeling sort of more raring to go. So I think there are hacks that you can use around focus and concentration, but ultimately, if you're trying to focus and concentrate on something that you're really not seeing any value in, then the first thing I do is trying to work out a way of feeling really good about what you're doing. And that may not be the problem here, but I think that's certainly a good point. And also trying to do it with a fresh brain, a refreshed brain, and of course mindfulness, if you want to help. That's got good evidence behind it too.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I'm going to try that with my children as well, because they also have the same challenge. So we've come to very nearly the end of our hour, and I was wondering if in the last couple of minutes you might like to tell us a bit about the class that you're going to be running, because there is a class that people can attend to learn more about this, specifically aimed at coaches, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit of knowledge about that before we all depart.
Sure. So I guess the opportunity of bringing coaches together is great, because we can have these kind of conversations and we can go deeper into the science behind them. So our outcome at the end of this class, this workshop, is that people leave with a great foundation to neuroscience, all of these elements that they need to be aware of, feel equipped to evaluate the data that keeps coming, the research that keeps going, so that you're in a credible position. And when you speak to other people, you can position yourself and your skill set with the added lens of neuroscience to say, look, not only do I know all of this stuff, but I also can look through the lens of neuroscience and help your organization with that added edge that certainly not everyone has from a credible perspective. Most people don't have, but we try and we're very perceived as very credible in the marketplace because we take the science really seriously, but we also do it in a very practical way. So we try and do fun stuff and do experiments and do things that will help you remember the information that you're walking away with, because we want everything to be layered. So we're going to focus on performance, on change, on all of the science that will help you to do those things better. And I know there's a webpage that you can find out more information, and by all means reach out if you have any questions. But the feedback's normally great from these kind of workshops, so if you're interested, then we'd love to see you join us.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. and that workshop can be found, we have that on the AWA website, I think, and so you can find out more about that there for sure. So thank you, Amy. That's been absolutely brilliant. It's been extremely useful for me, and I hope it's been useful for everybody else. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on your course, which I am going to.
Brilliant. And Daniel's put the link in there. That's kind of him.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and see you again next time. Take care.
Thanks for your questions.